Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. It's really an honor for me to chair this session where we are celebrating Marco Rosti's promotion to tenured associate professor. So let's start with a big round of applause for Marco. Despite his very young age, I think it's right to say that Marco is one of the world's leading experts in a very difficult and a very important field. And that difficult and important field is encapsulated in the very title of the talk he's going to be talking about, multiscale nature of multiphase turbulence. For some of you, perhaps these terms multiphase and multiscale might seem exotic, arcane, that kind of stuff. So I thought before I let Marco speak, I should make a few very introductory remarks about the very nature of the stuff that he works on. So I want you to picture one very familiar situation that you can see in your kitchen sink every single day. So imagine, you go to the kitchen sink and you open the tap and water starts to come out. And you take a bowl and you just stick it under it. So the water is coming out and striking the water in the bowl, right? So you're picturing this situation, I hope. And now this situation contrasted with a sketch more than 500 years old from the same part of the world where Marco comes from, which is one of these very famous sketches by Leonardo da Vinci. So it's a jet of water coming and plunging into a pool of water, and here's the flow that da Vinci depicts. I don't know a whole lot about art, but in my field, this is a very, very well-known sketch. And one of the reasons that this is a very well-known sketch is that what da Vinci is showing is nothing like what you actually see. The picture you have in mind looks nothing like this. What da Vinci is showing is a scientist's imagination of how the complex flow looks like when you have a jet of water plunging into a pool. And there are many things that could be said about this remarkable image, but one of the things I would like to point out is that the mess that we call turbulence, da Vinci is showing it as a superposition, several things. Of course, it's a sketch, but you could almost, if you stare at it enough, you could almost imagine all these little things are kind of swirling around. And these swirling around things, which we call in my field eddies, they are of small size to intermediate size to very large sizes. Multiple scales are interacting together. That's the multiscale nature of a turbulent flow. Another thing that's remarkable about this picture is what da Vinci is not showing. So if you again imagine back this jet of water plunging into this bowl, what you see a lot are all kinds of bubbles that are popping around. And these bubbles are popping around because as the jet enters water, it's entraining air inside. And that entrained air inside gets broken up into bubbles of various sizes. Those bubbles, in turn, interacting with the complex flow, can get broken up, so on and so forth. Da Vinci is not showing. That kind of a nature where it's water, air, all these things interacting together are a very characteristic feature of a multi-phase flow. So that's the kind of stuff that Marco works on. And just to make things harder for himself, Marco not only attacks this kind of very, very hard problems, but he attacks them from computational simulations of extremely difficult partial differential equations. These are nasty, these are nonlinear, these are coupled. Very few people can really handle the kind of complexity that Marco can handle. So he'll talk to us about his science, but one of the charming things in my field, fluid mechanics, are the kind of visualizations that you can produce. And it takes some talent to produce visualizations, and I'll just give you two examples. None of us would forget what we went through in the COVID era. And at that time, one of the things that was perhaps in everybody's ear is if anybody coughs even a little bit. And it's like ears are perking up that what's going on. Well, Marco's ears also perked up, and he decided to simulate. And this is what happens. A jet comes out, it breaks up into all kinds of remarkably complex multi-scale flow like this. So these things, it's not a painting. It's coming out of visualization of solving extremely difficult mathematical problem. And this is the kind of stuff that Marco is able to do. Very few people are able to do things like this. I'll give you another example. It's very hard to describe this one. I'm not sure if Marco is going to talk about that in his talk. But Basically, it's a very complicated flow over a surface. Simulating flows itself is very difficult, but when you add a surface on top of it, it becomes even more difficult. And what Marco is showing over here is that as you go away from the surfaces, depending on how you disturb the flow, the nature of the complexity can change quite a bit. So it's very hard to simulate this. It's equally hard to visualize this in this very, very attractive manner. So I'll now stop saying my nonsense, and I will just hand over to Marco. So Marco, please.
So thank you, Pinaki, for the great introduction. And I will actually use Leonardo da Vinci's picture as well. So, yeah. So just for the people who are new at OIST, I will slightly just give a quick introduction to also where I'm from. So as you can imagine from my accent, I'm Italian, and in particular from Milano, where I did all my undergraduate studies. I then moved to London for my PhD, and then as a postdoc, first in Sweden, in Stockholm, in the KTH Royal Institute of Technology. And then I moved in Japan, first in the University of Tokyo, and then finally here in Okinawa. So this is OIST, as you well know. So if you want to come to meet me and my group, we are in Lab 2, so the building on the left, and my office and my lab is on the faraway corner towards the sea. And I joined OIST in 2020, just before COVID, in January. So COVID happened just at the beginning, but I was lucky that 2 students decided to join my unit straight away. Then in the next coming 2 years, the size of the group was basically fixed by the fact that the borders were closed. And then in 2024, there was a spike of people coming to Japan and also joining the unit. And this is the latest picture we have from last year. We actually need to make a new picture this Friday. But some of these members have now moved. Like Janto was the first PhD who graduated in my group. He's now in Bremen, in Germany. Giovanni and Alessandro were 2 postdocs who now moved back, one in Italy and one in Netherlands. So we are roughly 10 people still now. And what we do is study multiphase turbulence. So Pinaki gave a great introduction of what it is, but in this talk I will try to be as simple as possible and try to give you more details on what I mean with multiphase, what I mean with turbulence, and why I studied this topic. So these are examples of flows that I would like to study and that I can define it as multiphase turbulence. So you can think of it as an avalanche of snow, a sandstorm, the breaking waves in the ocean that you can see in the morning when you have a choppy sea, microplastic in the ocean, which is not so nice to have, but if you want to study where this moves due to the ocean movement, or, for example, the flow on a windy day over a crop of fields. So all of these are multiphase turbulence from my point of view. And what does it mean? So I always have a fluid. It can be air, can be water, can be both. The flow is usually turbulent. Exactly what is turbulent I will discuss more later, but you can imagine to think that if you measure the velocity, for example, of the wind in one point, that signal will not be constant over time, but it will have some fluctuations. The nature of this fluctuation make it quite special, but the idea of turbulence is that you don't have a steady signal, at least. And then, in all these examples, we have something immersed into it. For example, here we have the crop, which are altering the velocity. Here we have the plastic. In the case of the breaking waves, you have the air and the water, which get entrained, as Pinaki mentioned before. And what we try to study in my group is how turbulence is modified by the presence of this immersed object. So this is the core of what we do. So I will show you only 2 equations in this talk. Just one is the governing equation of the problem. So we are lucky enough in our field that we know the governing equations up to a good level of approximations. And as Pinaki mentioned, they are quite complex. So they are a system of partial differential equations. So we have 1 equation for the evolution of the velocity of the water or air, whatever you are considering. And then these equations, so we have a time derivative, is nonlinear. And then there are some terms on the right-hand side. We have two unknowns, the velocity and the pressure. And then the velocity, we are in a three-dimensional world, so it has three components. The pressure is a scalar, so we need the four equations. There is one extra equation, which makes, it's just a constraint in this case, which makes the flow incompressible. But the idea is that we need to solve this equation at every time, in every point of the domain that we want to solve. And solving this can be quite complicated. We are probably the biggest user of the cluster here at OIST, by far, probably. And just to give you an idea, so our simulations are not maybe the one that you are familiar with. They may last months. And by months, I mean even 2, 3, 4 months. So you need to be sure that they are correct at the beginning to avoid wasting months of computational time. And the typical number of degree of freedoms that we have in our problems it's billions. So most of the cases that I will show you today, they are roughly 4 billion degree of freedom. And these 6 billion degree of freedoms, we need to solve at every time step for a certain number of time. And then we need to do some statistics of this huge database. So even without having to do the simulations, just looking at the data is already complicated just to be able to analyze the data itself. So we are lucky to have the equations, but the equations are difficult to solve, and it requires a huge amount of computation. So to do that, we use our own solver. So we wrote a code ourselves that is made to work on supercomputers, and hopefully as efficient as possible. So these equations are complicated, and mostly because of these nonlinear terms, generate what we call turbulence. So if we go back to 1883 in Manchester, I think, so Sir Osborne Reynolds performed this famous experiment in our field. So it's very simple. The idea is you just make a fluid flow into a pipe, and then you visualize the motion of the fluid by putting some ink at a certain point around here, and then you look how this ink moves inside the water flow. So you can control the flow in different ways. You can change the velocity with which the fluid is moving inside your pipe. I call it U. You can change the pipe diameter, making it bigger or smaller. I call this L. And then you can change the fluid that it's flowing. And this gives you different densities, rho, or different viscosity, mu. So Reynolds, one of the things that he discovered is that although it seems that you have 4 degrees of freedoms, actually what comes out is that you can combine them and you have a single non-dimensional number, which now we call Reynolds number in his honor, that actually dictate how the flow will behave in this pipe. So if we do this experiment for different Reynolds number, starting from a small value, so if we put the ink at the beginning, for small value of the Reynolds number, this ink will just go straight till the end of your pipe. This is what we call laminar flows. What instead I study and I find more interesting is if the Reynolds number is sufficiently high, the same ink that you were putting before will start having some very complicated patterns, and eventually will mix up with all the water, and then you will just see a dark fluids coming out of your pipe. Okay? So there are people studying where is the transition between these two regimes. This is not what we do. What we do is usually keep the Reynolds number sufficiently high to have a turbulent flow, and then we want to understand how this turbulent flow, what this turbulent flow is doing. Okay, so first thing, we need a high Reynolds number. You can have this in all situations in which you have a very strong velocity, U. If you think to a tornado, for example, the velocity of the air is very strong. So there, likely, your Reynolds number is large. You can have fluids with very little viscosity. You can have, you need fluids, you need problems with very large dimensions, which is why previously in the pictures that I show you, most of the flow were taken from geophysical applications, because there the length scale of your problem. This L is the order of kilometers, which already that make your Reynolds number very large. So all of what we do is to have this very large Reynolds number. And then here is the picture that Pinaki also mentioned. If we look at as Pinaki mentioned, in these pictures, both the sketch of the flow in the pipe and the one by Leonardo da Vinci, you can see these patterns. This is what, as Pinaki mentioned, is what we call eddies. So there is not a clear definition of eddies. It's just a region where you have a sort of coherency of the motion of your flow. So we now say that turbulence for us is a combination of these eddies. And as Pinaki mentioned, these eddies have different size. And also Leonardo da Vinci was able to picture that. So if you look at the largest one, they are of the order of your box. And then you have smaller ones and smaller ones. So this idea of having eddies of different size is the reason why turbulence is multiscale. You have all these different eddies of different size, which are interacting together and generating the mass that the turbulence is. So Richardson proposed a picture view of how turbulence is working. So remember the definition of the Reynolds number there on the top. So as I mentioned, the idea is that you have the eddies of the larger size, which are of the order of your problem size of your container. In the case of the pipe, is the pipe diameter. In the case of the ball, is the ball diameter, and so on. So these eddies are very large. It means their Reynolds number, since L is on the top, is very large. So viscosity, which is on the bottom, is comparatively small. So viscosity doesn't matter much as long as the Reynolds number is large. And then these large eddies instabilize, they break up and form smaller eddies. Again, these smaller eddies are still very large. The Reynolds number is still large enough that viscosity doesn't matter. So this process repeats till you reach a point in which these eddies are small enough, L is small enough, that the effect of viscosity comes back in. At that point, viscosity starts dissipating the energy of the system, and that's the end of turbulence somehow. So you have energy coming into your system at the bigger scale, then you have a flux of energy, and then you have a dissipation of energy. So this qualitative picture, well, again, the multiscale comes from the fact that you have each of these eddies have different size, L. Each of them will have a different velocity, a different time. So to study turbulence, you need to know for all possible L, the velocity, the time, and whatever other variable you have in your problem. One important thing of this picture is that the flux of energy, epsilon, is basically the amount of energy that you're injecting is then transported through scales and then is dissipated the same at the end. So this variable is very important for the theory, which was made by Kolmogorov in 1941. I will not go into the theory, but he basically created the mathematical framework to describe turbulence. And again, there is this pictorial view, which is just a more scientific version of the previous one. So you have, on this axis, you have the length of your eddy. You have energy, which we call in my field energy production. So energy is entering the system at the larger scale, is then transferred. The range of scales where energy enters is called energy containing range. Then energy is transferred through scales by this continuous breakup of eddies to smaller and smaller size. An important outcome of his theory is that this transfer of energy goes at a constant rate. And then finally, this is called inertial subrange. And finally, at the smallest scale, where viscosity starts to matter, energy is dissipated, and that's called the dissipation range. So one of the probably most famous results from Kolmogorov's theory is these relations about the energy spectra. So what is the energy spectra? Is the sort of how much energy you have in each scale or wave number. So K is the wave number. It's just 2 pi over L, where L is the scale that you are looking at. So large scales, large L, means small wave number, small scales, small l, means large wave number. So Kolmogorov predicted that the energy spectra, so the amount of energy that you have in each scale, this decay in the intermediate range away from the production and away from the dissipation as k to the power minus 5/3. So you can derive these in different waves. The cleanest one is just by dimensional analysis. But anyway, this has been verified a lot in the past. So this is, again, just the energy spectra function of the wave number k. And it is done for different experiments. And the region here, so these, the two axes are in a logarithmic scale, so you don't need to care about it. The important thing to notice is that at the large wave numbers, large k means small length, so the small scales of the flow, the energy is going down very quickly. At the large scale, which means large L and the small k, is where you have most of your energy, and there you have roughly flat spectra. So what this relation predicts is how the spectra behaves in this intermediate region, away from the large scales, which are here, and away from the small scales, which are there. So it basically predicts this decay rate of the energy. And yeah, so if we plug a line here with this slope, you will see that they follow it. So this is very nice. It's something that we know now for some time. So now the question is this still true for all of these problems? And that's what I will quickly show today to you. And that's what we study. So first of all, we redo a simple simulation, simple in the sense that it's still 4 billion degree of freedom over some time, but it's the simplest fluid that you consider. For example, air, you do one simulation, you compute the energy spectra, and this is what you get. So it's the energy, function of the wave number again, and this is again the energy decay predicted by Kolmogorov, k to the power minus 5/3. So this is the starting point. Now we start putting into the flow different things. For example, we can put particles, we can put fibers whose length is the same as the diameter of the particle, and the diameter is much smaller. We can put polymers into the flow. Now I will not go into detail what does it mean, but basically we are putting something very small but uniformly distributed in the domain, which gives some memory effects to the flow, meaning that the flow is becoming elastic. And then I can do something more. I can put also plasticity. So I put a minimum stress above which the fluid is actually elastic and below which the fluid is actually solid-like. So I can make the flow as complicated as I want, putting different features into it. It's an example of, so you can think about the particle simulation as a very simple way of modeling the sandstorm that I showed you before. You can think about the fibers as a very simple way of modeling the microplastic in the ocean. For polymers, it's a bit more difficult to explain, but for EVP, which is the needs of the fluid that behaves like a solid or a fluid, depending on how much stress you're applying to it, you can think very simply, for example, to a toothpaste. So toothpaste, you need a minimum amount of squeezing to bring it out of the tube. But if you put it on your toothbrush and put it upside down, it doesn't fall. And that's because there is a minimum level of stress or force, if you want, that you need to apply to make it behave like a fluid. Otherwise, it's just a solid. Another example of EVP is like lava. So sometimes there are crusts which are rigid, and sometimes it just flows like a fluid. So we can do all these simulations. So what I'm showing here, apart from the object, you don't need to say, it's just a slice. So I'm always in a three-dimensional space. I just cut through it in the middle, and this is what I'm showing you. And now for all of these flows, we look at the energy spectra. Starting from the particles. So this thin line on the back is the same coming out from the case where there is nothing immersed into the flow. So it's the very basic that follows Kolmogorov's theory. We put particles, and then what we get is this blue line. So energy, you have less energy compared to the single phase flow at the large scale. Then there is a region where the two spectra overlaps again, and then you have large energy compared to the basic case at the small scales. This point over here corresponds to the size of the particles. So everything which is the reduction of energy happens at scales which are larger than the particle, and then it goes down. If we look at the fibers, so now we have two sizes. One is the length of the fiber, which is around here. One is the diameter of the cross-section of the fiber, which is around there. And again, similarly to particle, you have less energy at the large scale and more energy at the small scales. But differently from the particles, there is no region where you have an energy spectral decay like Kolmogorov. You actually get something more close to k to the power minus 1. We can look at the case with polymers. So large scales now remains almost the same. In the intermediate range, you get something close to k to the power minus 7 over 3. And then you get something different also at the small scales, which is again similar to the other two. And then for the last fluid, EBP, again, it's very similar to the elastic. You still find Kolmogorov at the large scale in this new minus 7 over 3 in the intermediate one. So all of this is to say that Kolmogorov works pretty well for a very simple fluid. So if you have a turbulent flow of just air or of just water, it works. As soon as we put something and we think to a more complicated fluid, then this doesn't work anymore. And what we do in my group is try to understand, first of all, what happened, so how the presence of these objects modify the turbulence. So it may seem that all of these are very complicated and very different. So is there the possibility to have a single theory to try to cover all of them, or we need for each specific case something very different? So they look extremely different, but actually it's possible to somehow see a unified view of them. And we do that with the second equations that I will show you, and last one, so the energy balance. So it's an equations between 4 terms, which sum up gives you a constant. And if you remember this picture that I showed you before, it's just the mathematical way of seeing this. So there is this first term, F, which I call turbulent forcing, which is just a representation of the integral effect of the production. There is dissipation, which is dissipation again. There is this nonlinear energy flux, which is the integral across scales of this transfer of energy. So each of these terms is one of the elements of this sketch. Now, if we go to the single phase flow, which is what actually the theory works for, it's simple. So we have a balance between 3 terms. How much energy you are putting into the system, F injection. We are saying that energy is coming at the larger scale. So this curve is non-zero only at the smallest k, largest k, and after is always 0. So we are putting energy into the system at k equal 1, and then this term doesn't do anything else. Then we are transferring energy through scales, which is this intermediate thing, which in this picture is represented by this nonlinear energy flux, pi. So this term takes the energy that we are putting into the system at K1, it transfers it through scales, and then it just disappears. When it starts disappearing, when the last term remaining, the dissipation, starts mattering. So dissipation is actually always present, but initially it's very small, but then grows as the scales become smaller and smaller. Ultimately, this term will dominate and dissipate all the energy of the system. So this is for the basic fluid. Okay, and now again we look at our 4 test case. So first the particles. So for the so this is for single phase. For every time we put something in the flow, we have 1 extra terms, which is this m over here, which express how this immersed object is affecting the flow. So it's the coupling between the fluid and the immersed object. So now this is the same picture as before. We just remove the production term, because anyway it's always 0 except K1. So for the single phase case, you have two terms: the dissipation, which is the solid line, and the transfer of energy across scale, which is this dashed line. While what I call M, the multiphase part, in the single phase is 0, which is this dotted line on the bottom. Now for the particles, you can see that this transfer of energy through scales, which is probably the most important term in single phase turbulent, it's still present, but it's present only at the scales, is this dashed line over here. It's only present and dominant at scales smaller than the particle size. So this one is the particle size, and it dominates only in this small region. So in this region is where before, in the spectra, we saw the 5/3. While at a larger scale, actually the dominant contributions is the one coming from the interaction between particles. So particles are actually removing energy that you are injecting, and then they give it back only at scales smaller of them. In the case of fibers, it's again very different. So the nonlinear energy flux, which before was the most important contribution, is actually now basically 0. And everywhere, all the energy across scales is now brought by this interaction between the fluid and the fiber. If you want to see qualitatively why this happens, so in the case of the particles, so particles are big enough that behind them there is a wake. And this wake is actually turbulent, and that's what we are actually representing here with this term. In the case of fibers, instead, what matters is not really its length, but mostly its diameter, its smaller size. So its diameter is actually in the range where viscosity already matters. So the wake behind them is very different. It looks like maybe this picture that you may have seen around OIST. It's been used many times. This is the wake behind the cylinder, which is this black point in the front, come with a uniform flow through it. So this is simple. So here we get something similar. It's not the same because here the fiber is also moving around, and the flow is not uniform, but is actually turbulent. But still, you can see an analogous pattern. So particles and fibers gives you different energy spectra. Why? Because they give the way in which they interact with the flow, they are completely different. One last thing, then of course we can change the size of the particle. So instead of a big particle, we can do a small one, which is comparable to the diameter of the fiber. And then again, we find a very similar picture. So the nonlinear energy flux disappears, and all energy through scales is transferred by the interaction between particles and fluid. Now, this is very qualitative, but I will not go more into details. But the idea is that even if particles and fibers gives you very different results, you can actually find the similarities and hopefully give a single unified view. Even more, if you look, for example, polymers. Now, again, similar to the particles, we still have the nonlinear energy flux, but now this is acting at a larger scale. And now the interaction between the fluid and the polymers is actually what dominates at the intermediate scale. And here we provide a theory to make it even more similar to the particle case, so we can decompose this term into two extra terms, and now we will have a region of scales, so large scales, in which you can expect Kolmogorov to hold because the nonlinear energy flux dominates, a region where a new flux dominates, and then you can expect a different decay rate, and so on. And finally, for the EVP, if you remember, it was the same spectra as the polymers, and the reason is because even if the two fluids are completely different, but in terms of interaction with the fluid, which is this dotted line, they are basically the same. And I think that's it. So basically, what we do in my unit is try to study turbulence and try to understand how turbulence is modified by the presence of this immersed object. And due to the multiscale nature of turbulence, so the coexistence of these eddies of many different sizes, we need to do kind of multiscale analysis in order to understand actually how these objects are interacting with the different scale of the flow. And yeah, the ultimate goal is actually to have a theory which incorporates Kolmogorov, but to more general fluids. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have plenty of time for questions.
So the Kolmogorov scaling comes from the nonlinear part of the Cauchy equation. But the scaling is not trivially extracted from the expression of that nonlinearity. Are there some cases for fibers or particles in which the scaling directly appears from the energy contribution?
Okay, so this is more technical, but so in the classical case of Kolmogorov, so in the region where this term is flat, by assuming that this is flat, you can actually derive also the Kolmogorov scaling. In the case of, for example, of the polymers, as I said, we can decompose this extra term into two terms, one which becomes a pure flux. And in the region where this dominates, assuming that this is, again, the dominant term, in the same way as Kolmogorov derived the 5/3, you can define something similar to the one that we get in. So the basic idea of all this analysis is that ultimately you have mostly two kinds of terms. One is sort of a dissipation. You start from 0 and it grows. And the other is like a flux. You start from small or 0, it goes up, it remains flat, and then it goes down. So in the region where you have a dominant flux, then you can do similar derivation as Kolmogorov to derive the resulting energy spectra. In the region where you have dissipation dominating, then of course dissipation dominates, but depending on if you are forcing in that region or in another region, you will get different effects.
Yeah, thank you very much for a nice talk and great results overall. So I think you could have shown very nice videos where you see these kind of different scales and basically cascading. Now, if you have like a rigid cylinder, so we know basically how the wakes look like and how the energy spectrum looks like. So you have actually a recent work where you looked at flexible structures. So how would the energy spectrum change, or is it different?
So yeah, I didn't mention it, but in this case, I'm assuming that these rods are not deforming, so they are just like a pen. Its size and shape is fixed. But of course, everything can become more complicated by making this object deformable. So something that we do in my group also, is doing like deformable particles or fibers which bends. So the effects, there are multiple effects that you can study. So you can think. So in terms of actually energy, as long as it's a suspension, it doesn't change significantly. Of course, the amount of energy that is subtracting or the interaction with the flows changes, but in terms of qualitative pictures, I would say it's very similar. What really changes is the behavior of the object itself. So here I'm speaking only on the fluid, but then I can start looking, for example, if you think microplastic to the ocean, you want to know actually where this plastic is going. So that's something that comes out also from simulation, is not only how the fluid is changing because of the presence of this stuff, but also the motion of this immersed object. And that motion changes significantly depending if they are rigid or flexible. And that it's something else that we do. And in the case of the wakes, of waves, for example, we put fibers under a wave, and we can see how they drift.
Thanks. Yeah. And just a remark. So I think the tool you developed, tools of all which you developed are literally remarkable, and you can basically apply this for different fields of research. I'm looking forward also talk about applications for ocean waves. Thanks.
I think you mentioned it in your talk, but I didn't catch it very well. So I would imagine this computational simulations are very resource intensive and difficult. So what is the maximum dimension of time and size that you can simulate?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first of all, what I'm showing in this picture are very simple. So it's a small cubic box. everything is turbulent. So if you look back at the original pictures, probably what we are doing is a small point of this, 1 pixel, let's say, of this picture. Okay. Now, what we do, so actually is a good point, which I forgot to mention. So the reason why they're very complicated is, so as I said, you have all these scales. You have energy at all possible scales. So to do a full simulation like the one we do, you actually need to resolve all of them. So your resolution, you need a lot of points, let's say, in your simulation. So you need a lot of resources, just because we want to resolve all of them. If, for example, people who do weather forecasts, they don't actually solve these equations, because to do it for a planetary level, it's impossible, because it would require years just to do 1 second, maybe, or even more than. So what usually people do is actually model. You assume that the spectra is this shape, and then you forget about all these small scales, and you only look at the large ones, and then you put some model to hopefully represent what you are not resolving. The point is, if you do this for this multi-phase problem, you need to understand that actually the spectra is not this anymore. So that's why we do this mostly, because knowing that this spectra is changing means that if you want to do simulations at the, for example, weather forecast level, then you need to change the models to incorporate these effects into the problem. So going back to your question, probably we solve not, I don't know, maybe seconds of 1 pixel of this plot.
Thanks very much, Marco. Can I ask, does this incorporate also non-Newtonian fluids, or how does things change with non-Newtonian fluids?
Yeah, so thank you, Jason. So indeed, we also do that. Let me see. So in terms of equations, all of that, I didn't go through, but so this Cauchy stress, for Newtonian fluids, basically we have only 2 terms, 1 pressure and 1 viscous. If you want to do more complicated fluid, for example, later I mentioned polymers or EVP fluids, those are called non-Newtonian, and basically you have extra terms here on this Cauchy stress. So the equations formally remains the same. What changes is the definition of your Cauchy stress, which will have additional contribution. In most of the case, like the one that I show you, these extra contribution are tensors that you actually need to solve with additional equations. So for example, for the simulation that I show you for polymers or EVP fluids, the equations are not only these 4 scalar equations, but I have 6 more scalar equations. All of them are all coupled, and they are nonlinear, so you have multiple nonlinearity.
Bit of a mess. Can I ask another question? Do people consider sort of feedback experiments, or where you actually look at the flow and then start trying to change the particle positions, or heat them and change the way the flow is happening with some sort of feedback?
Yeah, so indeed, so I come from an aeronautical engineering background. So in my case, what we want to do usually is reduce the drag. So if you think again to this experiment, you need energy to move your fluid from the inlet to the outlet. And to do that, you would like to use as few energy as possible. Now, how to do this? So there is a full field of drag reduction of people who try to reduce drag. It can be drag in a pipe, can be the drag of an airplane flying in the sky, or whatever. And doing with multiphase flow, you can also do that. So if we go back here. So in the case of polymers, actually one of the main reasons that I study polymers is because if you put polymers in a pipe, actually you reduce drag. So all these changes that we see in terms of spectra, you can see in terms of drag, and then that's what we do. For particles or fibers, yes, indeed, the application may be different. So it could be that you want to study where particles are going. For example, if you think particles as a seed of a flower, you want to see where it will disperse, and then you need the flow that moves them is turbulent, and then you study the trajectory of these seeds. It could be the opposite, that you put particles because you want to, I don't know, enhance mixing, or you want to control them maybe magnetically. So yeah, you can think any kind of application, and then you can also decide to move them with an external force and then see how the flow is changing.
So in the ocean engineering and physical oceanography community, there is a debate about the universality of the slope. So you showed, of course, you have different cases you looked at, and you found basically a different cascade there. And for ocean waves, for instance, there are some people who do the modeling and measure the ocean waves. Sometimes they find -5/3, -5/4. So, but I personally never understood, like, why is it so important? So is it important? So what's your take on that?
First, one extra thing is, you said people measure different things. And the reason for that is that it's actually difficult to understand what's the slope. If you don't have a theory and try to match it, especially if what we call this range is called inertial range. If this inertial range is short, you can actually fit any kind of power you want. So you need a sufficiently long inertial range to be able to try to fit something. And you can get that only if your Reynolds number, which is what I said before, the ratio, like the velocity basically and the viscosity, is very large. So as you go from this case to this case, the Reynolds number is increasing, and the range where this grows, where this is a power law, increases. So first of all, you need large Reynolds number, and that's maybe why people were measuring different things. Another thing, so how universal is this? So it depends. So in multiphase case, I think you have very different scaling, so you don't really have it's more rare to have 5/3 than having it. For single phase flow, I would say that you have it reasonably well, but in the case of waves, yeah, it's not a it's classical single phase flow. So it may be. So actually, we are doing some simulation of that, and it may not be 5/3, but it may be very close to it. So that's also a trick.
Thanks.
Both of you have mentioned how incredibly difficult this is. So usually when something's incredibly difficult, most people try to avoid it. Where does the masochism come from? What's the motivation for you to focus on this particular incredibly difficult problem?
So
we all work on difficult problems, but
So in my case was, instead I studied aeronautical engineering, so I wanted to study airplanes. I studied airplanes, and I wanted to. The idea is if you are able in airplane to reduce drag even by less than 1%, you can actually get a huge reward in terms of income for the company or whatever. But getting that maybe 0.1% of reduced drag is very difficult. So initially in my PhD, for example, I was actually studying more aerodynamics problem. And then I started seeing that actually it was not so easy to understand them from that very applicable problem, but complicated. So studying the flow around an airplane, it's a mess. And so when I came at OIST, actually I did somehow a step backwards. I went to a more simple problem. So all these cases, as I said, they are a cubic box. So ideally it's very simple. And in terms of equation, is the cleanest problem that you can consider. So the complication starts then is no more in the geometry, but is in the fact that now you have all these scales that you need to resolve. And so what I like is actually, understanding what's going on. So in my case is, okay, the idea is I put this particle, what happens? So I think that's what triggers me mostly. Try to understand first predict, if possible, and then see if actually that's going on. Most of the time, no, but still is interesting.
And add a comment to it. Marco is an extremely humble character, so he's not going to say it, so I'll say it. People who study this kind of stuff, I don't think there are many who can cover the range that he's covering. So there are people who might study, particles, who might study fibers. But as a single person to study all of this is really very unique. Maybe it's some masochism, I don't know, but it's really very unique. And one of the things that allows him to do that, and one of the, really that allows us to kind of address problems that others are not able to do, and what benefit it brings is that he just hinted on it, but it might be that the end result of all of this is that there's a unified framework to understand each of these different things. Right now, people are doing it individually, boutique-like, and everybody thinks I'm developing a completely new boutique theory for this one. But that there is a bigger framework that explains everything under a single framework is really going to be a very remarkable breakthrough in a problem like this. So it's very complicated, and yet what is charming is there may be something very simple, relatively speaking, hidden under that complication. And it's people like Marco who make it possible.
I have a basic question. In this simulation for particles and the fibers, these are particle resolved simulation?
Yeah. So I didn't mention directly because so there are most of what we do is always all the objects that you see, they are there and they affect the flow. So they are, in technical words, yes, they are particle resolved, which is actually why we need this huge resolution. Most of the people, as maybe Pinaki mentioned now, actually they don't really put a particle, they just model it as a point particle, but we don't do that. What we do is it's a finite size object with its own shape, which has interaction with the fluid.
Great. So how is the particles concentration? Like, is it dilute or very concentrated? Because
so we change it. So in this case, it was, I think, 10%, but we can range from 0 to 30% within some time. We have different codes, mostly Simone, to do also very dense suspension up to close to the packing. So all these cases are very more dilute or semi-dilute, I would say. So this is 10% of particles. Fibers, it has the same mass fraction, but the volume fraction is slightly less.
So the 10%, up to 30% is the volume fraction or the mass fraction?
That one is the volume fraction. Mass fraction, we go from 0 to 1,
0 to 1.
Where 1 is an object so heavy that it doesn't move.
Okay, in that case, there's one final thing I need to do. The provost office has prepared a gift for Marco, and I got the chance of composing a sentence for that, and I like short sentences. So what I came up with, I don't know if you like it, is Marco, whose simulations reveal the poetry of complex flows. So that's basically what I think Marco does. And we are very lucky to have someone remarkable like Marco. So.